It was the autumn of 1649, but Mary Verney's health was failing. She was tired all the time now. She suffered from debilitating bouts of diarrhea, her fingers were numb, her nails had gone blue. She was living in exile in France with her husband, Sir Ralph, and a French doctor thought she had scurvy. But by November 1649, Ralph was getting worried, and he wrote to his uncle, who was also a doctor back in England, and asked for advice, a second opinion. An uncle doctor said, yeah, she might have scurvy, but the blue nails, the numbness were caused by obstructions which prevented her natural heat from reaching her extremities. He said lots of exercise should do it. He said Mary should take up tennis. Tennis wasn't going to help her. By Christmas 1649, Mary had developed a dreadful, persistent cough. Her uncle doctor said maybe she had consumption, a word which in the 17th century meant not just tuberculosis, but any kind of wasting disease. She may have had some form of cancer. The way her illness presented suggests she may have had mitral stenosis, a narrowing or obstruction of the opening of the mitral valve, which separates the upper and lower chambers on the left side of the heart. Usually brought on by rheumatic fever. It's quite a rarity these days. Symptoms include the peripheral cyanosis, which led her French doctor to think of scurvy. Then there's general lethargy, there's transient ischemic attacks, coughs, other respiratory problems. All of these things fitted with Mary's own symptoms. There's the surgical intervention, which is the only effective cure, wasn't even a possibility in 1649, of course. It was only 21 years since William Harvey had published De Motu Cordis. Many medical men were still sceptical about his theories on the motion of the heart and the circulation of the blood. In January 1650, Mary rallied a little, and a French doctor prescribed a dose of a diet of ass's milk, an idea which worried Uncle Doctor back in England. He said she should be bled. She should be bled under the tongue, or perhaps by making an incision in her jugular. The mind boggles, doesn't it? If she wouldn't consent, then she should at least have leeches applied to her throat. That would do her good. The interminable sadness of terminal illness played itself out that winter. The relatives wrote cheerful little notes saying how they were sure she was feeling better now. A friend in Paris sent her a recipe for chocolate, still a rarity in Western Europe, and hailed as a universal panacea, which indeed we know it is. Sir Ralph was sceptical, but then he decided his wife should try it. But he began to fret over the right dose. How much chocolate should she take? When should she take it? Should she have it before meals? Should she have it after meals? Should she have it in the morning? And eventually Uncle Doctor back in England told Ralph what in his heart he already knew. Mary could drink chocolate whenever she liked. It wasn't going to make any difference. I much doubt she hath no long time here. We doctors are miserable comforters, but it is fit you should both know the worst. There it was, out in the open. Mary was going to die. Uncle Doctor had been privately convinced of it for some time, but he'd hoped she might live through the summer. Now he doubted it. And when he heard she'd been having fits, he did something which in an age more intimate with death seemed less peculiar than it might do now. He wrote her from England a long, uplifting letter, urging her to prepare herself. Corn cannot live except it be buried in the earth, he said. Death and sickness are but the fire through which we must pass to the city of the living God, to the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels. Mary never read that letter. She died before it arrived, at the age of 34. And her husband, Ralph, was overcome. All he could write in his journal was, oh, my dear, my dear, my dear. How is it that we know so much about Mary's last days? How is it that the death of this woman 370 years ago affects me so much. I still today find it hard to talk about it. The answer lies at the Verneys family seat of Claydon in Buckinghamshire, and a chance discovery in the attics there. Claydon, which had been the Verney family seat since the late 16th, early 17th century, it had gone through bad times in the 18th century. The profligate second Earl had trebled it in size, but he didn't have the money to do it. He died in debt. The house was partly dismantled. And then in 1827, a distant cousin, Sir Harry Calvert, inherited Claydon, and he inherited a place with a long pedigree and an uncertain future. He changed his name to Verney, and he started to take stock of what he'd got. There were serious structural weaknesses where the house had been jerry-built and, as I say, partly dismantled. There were family portraits by Van Dyck and Lely and Cornelius Jansen. They stacked in outhouses. One of them, he said, was fastened over a hole to keep out the rats. That's what you do with Van Dyck's, isn't it? And as he took stock, Sir Harry discovered a wainscoted gallery at the top of Clayton House. It was 40 feet long, and it was crammed to overflowing with more than 100,000 family and estate papers. They were bundled up in heaps on the floor. They were stacked against the walls. They were laid out on trestle tables. There were playbills and rent rolls. There were newsletters and notebooks. There was an enormous amount of personal correspondence, which had been kept, it seemed, for no other reason than because it was there. One bundle carried the label, "Private Letters of No Interest." These documents ranged in date from the 14th century to the 18th. The 17th century was particularly well represented as well. There were more than 30,000 private letters in that gallery. In fact, when he opened the door to that room, Sir Harry stumbled upon the largest, most continuous private collection of 17th century correspondence in Britain, perhaps even the Western world. It was astonishing, and what a story it told. The lives of this apparently ordinary gentry family were recorded in the most intimate detail. The Verneys not only married and died and entertained and squabbled and did all the things that gentry families were meant to do. They fought in France and the Netherlands. They travelled to the plantations of Barbados and the forests of Virginia. They took refuge in the desert fortresses of North Africa and traded in the souks of the Levant. Some of them looked on appalled at the brutalities of war. Others were the perpetrators. Some were kind and highly principled. Others were cheats and robbers. Some married for money, others died for love. And everything from petty victories and dreadful tragedies to the books they read and the food they ate was recorded in these letters. It is an incredible collection. And they leap from the pages of these letters. They're an astonishing family, the Verneys. Take, for example, Sir Francis. Sir Francis Verney was head of the household in the early 17th century. He was still quite young, in his 20s. And in 1609, 1608, he fell out with his wife. Well, that happened in Jacobean England. Marriages didn't work. He walked out on his wife, in fact. Well, that happened too in Jacobean England every now and then. But Sir Francis, having walked out on his wife, kept on walking until he got to North Africa, where he converted to Islam, became a Barbary pirate, and returned to terrorize the south coast of England. Now, that didn't happen very often in Jacobean England. Sir Francis was amazing. The family, it was interesting, the family, when he was rediscovered in the 19th century, the family loved the idea that they had a pirate in their past. That was romantic. The idea that he'd converted to Islam appalled them. A pirate was romantic, but an apostate was just beyond the pale. They just denied it, frankly. It didn't happen. Sir Francis died in Sicily, in Messina, in 1615, and his turban and his robes were dispatched back to Claydon. His brother became head of the household, Sir Edmund, And Sir Edmund, although he wasn't quite as flamboyant as the pirate Francis, Sir Edmund was still quite a wild one. He was a professional courtier. He was in the court of Henry, Prince of Wales, the young son of James I, the best king we never had because Henry died early. Sir Edmund became head of security at Whitehall Palace. He lived partly in Covent Garden. He had a couple of houses in Covent Garden and Clayton House. By and large, he enjoyed himself in London while his wife Margaret stayed at home with their 10 children. And it's interesting that there's a role reversal that goes on between Edmund and his eldest son, Ralph. Ralph is the one who was married to Mary. Ralph is the one who was overcome by Mary's death. Oh, my dear, my dear. And Ralph was a solid lad. He was not like his father. His father was wild, up for anything. Ralph wasn't. He was conventional. He was staid. He was the kind of chap who if he'd had a CD collection, he would have had all the CDs in alphabetical order. He was a methodical chap. And this really comes home in the Scotch Wars of 1639, when Sir Edmund drops everything and rushes, even though he's a middle-aged man, he rushes up to Scotland to fight for the king. And not only does he join the army, the king's army, but he puts himself at the head of it. When an English force is ordered to take some men and cross the border into Scotland, thereby effectively declaring war on the Scots, Sir Edmund immediately volunteers to go with him in the vanguard. And when he hears this, his son Ralph writes his father a letter so full of anger and pain and fear that it sounds to all the world like a desperately worried father rather than a dutiful son. He writes, "You may easily guess how this news afflicts me. If you go, knowing your forwardness, I shall never think to see you more. I with grief confess that never man did more wilfully cast himself away. Till now, I never had the least reason to suspect your affection for me. But when I see you thus hastily run to your own ruin, purposely to lose that life which is much dearer to me than my own, how can I think you love me? How can I think you love me? Hath the vain hope of a little fading honour swallowed up all your good nature?" And of course, this is where Ralph misunderstands his father. A little fading honour. Sir Edmund belongs to a generation of effectively Elizabethan courtiers who don't just pay lip service to sentiments. Honour isn't just a notion to them. It's what they are. It's who they are. Honour is more important than life itself. And Sir Edmund, not only did he enjoy war, and he did, but also he did what he should do. He had a very strong sense of duty. In fact, this comes out. He survived the Scots Wars. He came back with his entourage and his armour. Everything came back safe. But 3 years later, he was fighting for the king at the Battle of Edge Hill, the first major engagement of the Civil War. And the irony is that Sir Edmund was a parliamentarian at heart. He didn't agree with what Charles I was doing. He sided with Parliament. But as he said to a friend, he'd been a courtier. "I have taken the king's bread these 30 years. I cannot desert him now." He did what was right as far as he was concerned. He couldn't forsake his king, even though he didn't agree with him. And he died at Edge Hill. His body was never found. Just his hand, his gauntleted hand, still clutching the royal standard where it had been hacked off on the battlefield. And it's dreadful. Ralph was for Parliament, his son was for Parliament, and his son was actually sitting in the House of Commons when the news came in that there had been a great battle at Edge Hill, that the king's forces had been defeated. They hadn't exactly, but that was the news. And that among the dead, there was the king's standard bearer, Sir Edmund Verney. And everybody in the Commons stood up and cheered. Except Ralph. Imagine what that was like. Your own father dead and everyone cheering. There are other kinds of heroism, though. Ralph, although he supported Parliament, he refused to sign the Solemn League and Covenant. And as a result, he was forced into exile, which is what he and Mary were doing in France when she died in 1650. There were other members of the family too. They took different paths. Ralph had three brothers. Munn, short for Edmund, named for his father. Munn fought for the king. He wouldn't speak to Ralph. It took that by a sword divided. The family was split in two by the English Civil War. Munn fought for the king. He survived the Civil War. He was at Drogheda when Cromwell's forces took Drogheda with amazing brutality after the war was over. And he survived that. But he didn't survive the aftermath. He was walking with some of Cromwell's officers through the streets of Drogheda. He was technically a prisoner of war. He was walking with them after the battle, after the siege. And a man called to him from across the street. And Munn thought he recognised him. He wasn't sure. He walked over. And this man stabbed him to death and left him to die in the gutter. No one knew why. No one today knows why. One of those stupid, arbitrary things. Ralph's second brother was Henry, who was also wild. He was a horse racer. He was a gambler. He once lost £600 on a race. That's 200 times a maid's annual wage in the mid-17th century. Amazing. And then there was Tom. Tom, in lots of ways, Tom's my favourite of the Verney boys. There is nothing good to be said about Tom. Not a single thing. I've read hundreds of letters from Tom to his father, his mother, his brothers, his sisters. Every single one of them has a request for money in it. Every single one. He deserted at least two wives. He took some indentured servants over to Barbados. His father packed him off to Barbados in the hope that he would make something of himself or die. At least he wouldn't come back. He took some indentured servants from Buckinghamshire with him. And when he got there, he sold them. They weren't happy, nor were their family back in. It was their family back in England. Tom had to write and warn his father warn his brothers rather, to kind of keep out of the way, because the brother of one of these indentured servants had threatened to kill the Verneys at home. They were so cross. He stole from his brothers. He forged cheques, the 17th century equivalent of cheques. He broke open his brother's desk and stole money from that. He informed on comrades in arms. As I say, he deserted at least two wives, one of whom had a baby by him. His most astonishing escapade, I think, was after the Civil War, when he was being hunted down. He'd played both sides, so both sides were after him. He went to France in hiding. He was starving. He had nothing. He was taken in by some French monks. He was nursed back to health. He was clothed. He was fed. And Tom Verney repaid these monks by stealing the altar plate and hightailing it back to England. He was quite a lad, quite a piece of work. The Verney men are great fun. Not without their faults, clearly, but they're great fun. The women are something else, actually. The women are even more intriguing in lots of ways. And what I want to do for the rest of this talk is to think a little bit about those women. There was Ralph's godmother, who was, well, everybody called her name was Eleanor, and she had a habit of marrying wealthy noblemen. She married four, in fact, and they died one after the other. She married wealthy, old noblemen. In fact, her nickname in the Verney family was Old Men's Wife. But she's an amazing woman. There's a fantastic sequence of correspondence in the Verney papers where Sir Edmund persuades Van Dyck to paint Eleanor's portrait. It's quite a big deal, this. A stream of aristocratic clients used to find their way to the urbane courtier artist's little shop of beauty, as it was called, in Blackfriars. It was a fantastic spot. It was a great honour to be painted by Van Dyck. Eleanor didn't want to sit for it. She said it was a waste of money. A full length was about £50, and the Verneys were paying for it. A half length was £30, head and shoulders £20. She didn't want to waste the Verneys' money. But once she'd agreed, all of these demands got fly from her. She it was decided she should be shown wearing a sable over her dress, a sable fur. But she was keen that Van Dyck should make the fur look bigger and fluffier, perhaps, than it really was. The gown she wore should be altered slightly, made to look a little bit richer. A clasp. She thought perhaps if Van Dyck painted a clasp with some big diamonds, that might go well too, even though she didn't have those big diamonds. It is no great matter for another age to think me richer than I was, she says. But her main worry is that Van Dyck was going to make her look fat. She continually pleaded with Rafe, her godson, who was driven nuts by her constant sort of pleading. She said that she wanted the artist to make my picture leaner. Rafe himself has to make Van Dyck trim the picture for my advantage. In fact, when it was delivered to Covent Garden, she was still fretting that she looked ugly. She said that when copies were made of the Van Dyck, as this was normal, if Van Dyck painted the portraits, copies were made. And she said that whether that man, could we find out whether that man that copies Van Dyck's could not mend my face? The cheeks looked a bit plump, her hips looked a bit plump. She wanted the 17th century put into a Photoshop job. So Van Dyck wisely decamped to Antwerp round about this time, and the portrait is lost. But I have this notion that scattered in country houses all over England, there are different Eleanors, different portraits of her, all the same one, but looking gradually thinner and thinner and thinner. The daughters, Rafe's sisters, Sir Edmund's daughters, were an interesting bunch too. There were 6 of them, 6 girls, and in 1642, when Sir Edmund Verney died at Edge Hill, only Carey was married. She married a royalist officer, and a skirmish outside Oxford in July 1645 was to leave her widowed and pregnant at 18. Her husband's family threw her out. The other 5 girls, Susan, Pen, Peg, Moll, and Betty, had little to. They were all unmarried. They had little to offer suitors in the way of financial inducement. And when Rafe fled to the continent into exile in 1643, leaving a mountain of debt behind him, the 5 girls' options became more limited still, and it looked as if they were never going to marry. In fact, in 1646, 3 of them managed to find husbands. Peg, who was 22, chose the wrong one. Within weeks of her wedding, she was struggling to cope with her husband's jealous temper. His violence grew worse and worse with each passing month. He abused her, basically. Susan found a charming widower, a childless widower. He was a really nice man, but he was poor. He was so poor, in fact, that the couple honeymooned in the Fleet prison where he'd been put for debt. Then there was 24-year-old Pen. She married a cousin with a reputation for drink. According to a relation, she grew in years and was not to all men's liking. These reasons made her so ready to yield. Anyway, she said, when we're married, he'll change. He didn't. Her husband, John, was routinely violent to her, kicking and punching her, threatening her. She used to have to lock herself and the maid in their bedchamber while he hammered on the door, saying he was going to cut their throats when he got in. These were not happy marriages. But the intriguing thing is not the unhappiness of the marriage, it's actually the women's responses. The Verney women could show a less compliant side when the occasion presented itself. For example, there was an embarrassing scene in the middle of Aylesbury one day when Pen and her violent husband were waiting to board the London coach. It was raining. And Pen's husband, John, as the coach pulled up, he elbowed her out of the way to get into the carriage first. There wasn't much room. Not very gentlemanly. And Pen thought the same, because what Pen did in the middle of the market square in Aylesbury, she grabbed him by the shoulder, she dragged him back out of the coach, she punched him in the face, knocked him down, and then daintily stepped over his prostrate form, got in the coach and settled down. He had to go all the way to London, sitting on the back of the coach in the rain, nursing a black eye. That's not what gentlewomen were meant to do in 17th century England. Peg, who put up with her violent husband for 11 years, just walked out on him. She walked out on him in 1657, she never went back. That's not what gentlewomen were supposed to do in the 17th century. The youngster, Betty, who was not married still in 1662, she thought she was never going to marry, so she ran off with a young curate. She had enough of waiting. 17th century England was pretty clear about how its women should behave. Modesty, meekness, compassion, courtesy, and piety were those general qualifications which are at once the duty and the ornament of the female sex. All the conduct manuals advised girls that obedience was the thing. You obey your husband. The paragon of female virtue is, I quote, is very discreet, wise, and prudent in her actions, modestly grave and composed. If a husband fooled around, and let's face it, a lot of husbands did, her best course of action was to maintain a dignified silence and use his guilt to get something out of him. Whether it be to cover or redeem his offence, you may have the good effect of it while it lasts. That's what was supposed to happen. You were demure, you were modest, you were obedient. Not if you were a Verney, you weren't. It didn't work like that. Take, for example, Moll Verney. Moll Verney's fascinating. She's wonderful. She was living in London, single, and this is Rafe's sister, another of Rafe's sisters. She's living in London alone with her maid in the 1650s. She's not married still, but she's got 3 suitors. She's got, there's a son of a nobleman who's interested in her. There's the son of a gentleman who's interested in her. And there's an apothecary's assistant who's interested in her. In the summer of 1654, Moll starts to put on a bit of weight. You know what's coming, don't you? She starts to get a little bit round in the belly. She says she's got colic. Then finally, she admits it's a little bit more than that. Well, the whole family says, no, please, if it's the son of a nobleman, he can marry her, that's fine. If it's the son of the gentleman, he can marry her, that's fine. Please let it not be the apothecary's assistant. And of course, it was the apothecary's assistant who got her pregnant, and she showed no inclination to marry him at all. She went to her brother and she begged him for money. Rafe kept doled out an allowance to her quarterly, but he didn't give her very much, and she was always spending it far too quickly. She begged Rafe to give her money for her lying in, for her, so that she could be looked after properly with midwife. She wanted £20. If Rafe would give her £20, she would do anything, she said. Truly, brother, if you please but to disperse this much for me, I shall ever acknowledge myself obliged to you. If it please God to see me recovered, I will go to any place you shall desire. She would do anything. Rafe sent her a very stern brotherly letter, telling her she was no better than she should be, telling her she should be ashamed of herself, having the giving her the £20 and saying that's it. Then she must leave the country because she was bringing shame on the family, an illegitimate birth, or shame on the entire family. She should leave well away from London, well away from their friends, well away from Buckinghamshire. An uncle very helpfully said Bermuda might be better than Ireland, by which he meant Bermuda was further away. So Moll had a baby. It was given away. And then she decided that she didn't really want to go to Ireland or Bermuda. She was having more fun in London, and she was still having fun with her apothecary's assistant who wasn't marrying. She said to her brother, perhaps I'll think of going, I will go, I promised I will leave, but not just yet. Perhaps if you gave me a little bit more money. How about that? And Rafe said, no, no more money. You've made your promises, you've brought this all on yourself, we have an agreement, you're off. And she said, well, no, I'm not really. If you won't give me any money, then I'll leave London. I'll come to Claydon. I'll come to Buckinghamshire. And what I'll do, I will lie down at the gates of Clayton House and I'll starve to death there. What do you think of that, brother? And Ray, faced with the prospect of disgrace and the entire county knowing what his sister was up to, relented. He sent her money and said, now you've got to leave. This went on for 2.5 years. 2.5 years, during which time Mal married her apothecary's assistant. They were married by a dodgy vicar in Paddington. She continued to extort money out of Ray, perfectly happily. He continued to say, this is the last time, you're not getting another penny from me. And she'd say, then I'll just tell everybody. If you won't buy me a dress, well, I'll have to go naked. I'll come to Buckingham. I'll come to Aylesbury. I'll come to Claydon. I'll go naked there, shall I, brother? What do you think of that? And the money came. She was amazing. I mean, this was not what women were supposed to do in the 17th century, not gentlewomen. And Mull did. But the Verney girls weren't compliant. They didn't follow the rules. And I suspect, I mean, no family's ordinary, and some are a lot more extraordinary than others, and the Verneys are one of those. But I suspect the Verney girls mirror actual practice in 17th century gentry England much more closely than the conduct manuals and the etiquette manuals tell us. That's what was expected of women, not what they did. And the Verney girls, I think, suggest to us what they did. They wouldn't stand still. They wouldn't just take beatings from their husbands as if it was their duty. They wouldn't go off into exile when they were having fun in the big city. They had lives of their own. They had wills of their own. And that's what makes them so interesting, I think. There's so much more. There's so much more I could say. The Verney, take for example, the Ralph's two sons. Ralph has two sons. Munn, again, another one named for Edmund. It's quite confusing in the Verney family because they're all Edmunds or Ralphs. And they do get a little bit muddled sometimes. So Ralph has, with Mary, who died, Ralph has two sons. He has Munn and Jack. Munn is the eldest. Munn is the heir. And he's not without his own faults. He marries a beautiful neighbour called Mary. And she's an heiress, which makes her a lot more beautiful in Ralph's eyes. Munn marries this girl, Mary, who comes with the neighbouring estate. But it quite quickly emerges that Mary is mad. She's possibly schizophrenic. She's certainly bipolar. She self-harms. She has paranoid delusions. She's convinced that her husband is sleeping with all of their friends and all of the servants. And indeed, he is. Munn was incorrigible. He was impossible. He was a serial adulterer. So her paranoid, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. So I mean, but the family didn't know what to do. As Mary descends into more serious psychosis, they don't know what to do. She could go to Bedlam. That's the only mad hospital in England, in fact, in one of the time. It's in the 1660s. But the disgrace of that will be unthinkable. So they shut her up in their London house. They have carers. And ironically, I mean, Ralph says, look, just keep her busy and she'll come out of it. And weirdly, she does. She does emerge from her madness for increasingly longer periods. She's never quite sane, but she's functional for much of her life. In the meantime, Munn is still philandering, still sleeping with anybody who will stay still for long enough, and putting on more and more weight. At one point, he's 280 pounds. He's so fat that he says he can't ride his horse in the muddy lanes of Buckinghamshire because he'll sink into the mud. Jack, his brother, meantime, has been packed off to Syria, to Aleppo, as a merchant, basically a silk merchant, working in the markets there. He's sent there to earn his living as a young man. As a younger son, he's got no fortune. He's got to make his own way. And there's some amazing letters from or between Mun and Jack. Mun is, he asks Jack to send him a turban and a scimitar and a bow and arrow and a Persian robe because he has a fancy to wear them. And he tells Jack, he gives a very brotherly, sort of stern brotherly letter. He says to Jack, I hope you're not wasting your time. I hope you're doing business, you're making money, you're working hard, and not just wasting your time in Aleppo. And Jack writes, sends the scimitar and the turban and the robes and the bow and arrow, and sends a very defensive letter back saying he's working all the hours God gives him. The only exercise he gets is occasional hunting in the hills outside Aleppo, or this is 1664, mind. Sometimes he plays cricket. Now, just picture this for a moment. You've got Jack from Buckinghamshire hitting a six on the plains of Antioch, while at the same time his brother Mun, his fat brother Mun, is lurching around the fields of Buckinghamshire wearing a Persian robe and turban with a bow and arrow. I mean, you couldn't make that stuff up. History's a lot more fun than fiction. Then there's Dyck House, who's a cousin of the Verneys. He's a good lad, Dyck. His only slight character flaw, is that he's a highwayman. He robs people. He is a full professional Dick Turpin type highwayman. And the interesting thing is that although he's a highwayman, although he's an armed robber, he's charming. And all the Verney aunties all love him. Isn't he sweet? They have him round for tea, or the 17th century equivalent. They bail him out of jail. They all pet him and say what a sweetheart he is, and nobody really understands him. And you forget, often in history, I think, we forget the power of charm. This chap is a criminal. He's a bad man. He was, in fact, he's sentenced to death 3 times, sentenced to hang 3 times. He escapes from jail twice, which is good, but not good enough, if you think about it. 3rd time unlucky, and he ends up on the gallows. But because he was such a nice lad, he managed to sort of, he would go into hiding with his aunties. They would slip him money secretly. They would help him to escape from jail on the frequent occasions he was stuck in prison, because they thought he was a sweet boy, really, misunderstood. So that's the Verneys, really. They're the most amazing family. And because of this collection of correspondence we have, we know them. Their story is a series of conversations with all that implies. Because not only are the letters to other people in this collection, but the Verneys, most of them anyway, make fair copies they have letters back from people, but also they make fair copies of their own letters. So it's not a monologue, it's not like a diary, it's much richer than that. The Verney papers are a series of conversations of to's and fro's. We get both sides of things. We see the letter writers make mistakes. They jump to conclusions. They vent their anger and then they regret it. They're hopelessly indiscreet 1 minute, they're furtive the next. They say hurtful things and then they can't understand the hurt they've caused. I didn't mean it. And they lay themselves there. An impoverished aunt in one pleads for money to pay her gambling debts. Defiant Moll, wild as a buck Moll, they called her in the family. A defiant Moll refuses to give up the father of her bastard child. Mothers weep for their dead babies. And Rafe, when we started, Rafe, the desperate husband, refuses to admit to himself that his wife is going to die. Amid all the light that the Verneys story sheds on life in 17th century England, this haunting vulnerability is a shadow which lingers. We know the Verneys almost too well, and it's impossible not to care. Thank you for listening to me.